So thank you, Erin. It is a pleasure to be here today. As Erin mentioned, let's see if I get to the slides. I was asked to provide an update for what is happening with PRGLAC. It is, as Erin mentioned, we've got a working group of council that is looking at the implementation of PRGLAC. One of the things that I need to be cognizant of is that this group has been working for the past 9 months. Their charge is to provide a report to NICHD Council. Because that report has not gone to council yet, I am a little restricted with respect to what I can tell you today. If this meeting had been about 3 weeks later, we would have been good to go to give you a little bit more detail. So I'm going to have to take a step back a little bit. I'm going to actually go through more of a history of PRGLAC, talk to you about what the recommendations looked like for those of you that don't have that background, and then describe the process that this working group has been doing without getting too far into the weeds with respect to their findings. Eventually talk about some overarching themes, and then talk a little bit about what the reporting structure looks like. So where did PRGLAC start? And it didn't start with 21st Century Cures. It started actually with the Safe Medications for Moms and Babies Act of 2016. You could see that it was sponsored. It was bipartisan by both a Democrat and a Republican. And it had several major lobbying groups, including SMFM, ACOG, and the March of Dimes. And in that legislation, there were several requirements. They were asking DHHS to establish a task force to look at the development of safe and effective therapies for pregnant and lactating women, to examine ethical issues around including pregnant and lactating women in research, examine federal research activities around PRGLAC, and then look at what is happening on the regulatory front. So FDA reporting for NDAs and SNDAs and approvals and labeling changes, and whether or not these included pregnant and lactating women. This legislation is classified as having died. It actually never went to vote, but it did get pulled into the 21st Century Cures Act. And if you look at how it's laid out in 21st Century Cures, it looks almost exactly like the legislation that we just saw. So in essence, it got extracted and pulled into 21st Century Cures and was approved in kind of the format that we saw it in the original legislation. That happened at the end of 2016. And part of that legislation was to establish this task force that was really meant to look at what was happening in the area of pregnancy and lactation. And those task force members that were the first individuals kind of looking at this activity were primarily federal employees. So you could see a fair number of NIH employees, along with AHRQ, CDC, DOD, FDA, HRSA, and the VA. So we've got individuals kind of informing on the status of pregnancy and lactation in drug development, in research, coming primarily from the federal sector. That group met 4 times over 2017 to 2018. And they prepared a report that went to HHS in 2018. And in that report, they outlined 15 recommendations. And I don't want to go through all of them in detail, but you can see that they relate to enhancing research opportunities in pregnancy and lactation, removing barriers that exist to including pregnant and lactating women in research, stimulating a conversation around the idea of inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in research, and then infrastructure development, that type of thing. As part of that, they also recommended that the task force activities be extended to continue this work, to dive a little bit deeper, and then to establish an advisory committee that monitored implementation. So HHS made a determination in 2019 to go ahead and extend that charter, that recommendation 14. And this time they established another task force. Now we've got the same group of federal employees engaged, but we've also got pharma represented and hospitals represented and universities represented, along with some NGOs and private foundations. And that second or extended task force met throughout 2019 and 2020. and then created their report for HHS. And it basically took those 15 recommendations and layered sub-recommendations and sub-recommendations, over 100 in total, to help shape the way that implementation of those recommendations occurred. So to provide a little bit more granularity to help understand where the real focus needed to be. Part of that, again, was establishing a working group for implementation. And as you could see here, it had bipartisan support. So this is a letter to HHS that was signed by numerous legislators on both sides of the aisle, strongly encouraging the setting up another task force or working group to really now track what was happening. Are we making any headway? Is the needle moving with respect to pregnancy and lactation? And we saw from there legislation that appropriated additional resources to actually put this working group together. And so the working group was assembled in 2023. We've been active for about 9 months now, a slightly shortened time frame because the time the appropriation was made and the time the money actually hit the door was a slight delay. And again, you can see here now we've got an even smaller group of federal agencies along with pharma, again represented, and academic medicine, NGOs, professional societies, all weighing in to contribute to an impression of where we are from an implementation status on these recommendations. So to do this, it would have been futile to go recommendation by recommendation. What we chose to do was to look at it by clusters. So we grouped anything that was involved in the conduct of clinical research and trials into one cluster, education, outreach, training, and career development into a second cluster, things that had to do with policy, regulatory issues, and liability into a third cluster, registries, real-world data, so real-world evidence kind of research into a fourth cluster, and then novel drug discovery and development into a fifth cluster. And what the working group did to the best of their ability was try to understand how far along we were with each of those recommendations. And we kind of used a green, yellow, red scheme to see, had it been fully implemented, had it been initiated and was implementation in process, or had there been no action or no traction towards that particular recommendation. And it could not be comprehensive. We had a very abbreviated time frame to work with. So you can see the recommendations that we've got clustered here. For cluster A and E, our primary representatives that were sharing data, sharing information to the working group came from NIH. When we looked at cluster B, education, outreach, and training, that expanded. So now we had speakers providing information to our working group from ACOG, from Mother to Baby, from SFM, and from CDC. For cluster C, primarily it was information that came to us through FDA. And then when we looked at real world data and registries, we were looking at NIH as a larger entity along with FDA and ONC from CMS. There were some recommendations that the group didn't discuss, and that was simply because they had already been completed prior to the initiation of our working group. And then there were some that weren't discussed, and they actually were discussed kind of at the tail end of our meetings because they were awaiting external reports. So some recommendations required HHS to weigh in. Some recommendations required NAS to weigh in. They actually had convened a group to take a look at some of these issues. And so we largely looked at reports to address those particular recommendations. There were some that were also not discussed because in the opinion of the co-chairs and the folks convening this task force, we felt that either congressional action was needed, so legislation had to take place for those recommendations to move forward, or resources need to be made available. They simply could not move forward without resources, and so those did not take a lot of time in the discussion of this working group. So I can't go into detail on the report itself. That will be made available, publicly available towards the end of June, beginning of July. But I will talk about some of the overarching themes that came out from this task force as we looked at all of these recommendations. And the first was that we had to get away from looking at pregnancy and lactation as a distinct entity. They really are different. They have different resource needs. The research requirements and the research challenges are different. And so we as a group really tried to look independently at where was progress made on the pregnancy side and where was progress made on the lactation side, and just to get a better sense of where the gaps still remained. We also identified that many of the recommendations that we saw didn't actually have owners assigned to them, and we saw limited progress because no one ever came out and said, here is who should be owning this recommendation. We did see entities try to take ownership. They were using existing resources. They didn't have additional appropriations to do so. And so this is a challenge that I think we're going to have to overcome to make sure that we've got buy-in as to who really is responsible for moving some of these recommendations forward. Other recommendations require multi-stakeholder engagement. They're not a single recommendation owner. And the problem we have there is there needs to be a convening party or a convening authority to bring those individuals together. And again, without that being explicitly called out or resourced, this is going to be particularly challenged to move some of those recommendations forward. As I mentioned, some of the recommendations required resources or congressional action, and we were careful to highlight what we felt those were in the report. And then the working group as a whole, as the task force before them said, we really believe that there needs to be continued implementation progress assessment because we're not there yet. We don't really have the majority of these recommendations in the green and completed. So our goal now is to get the report to HHS by 2024. It should be there by the end of June. This says the report to Congress. My understanding is what actually happens is the report is made publicly available and Congress is directed to the report as it's made available on the website. And then what is going to happen in the future is unclear. Is this going to lead to additional assessment extension? Is there going to be legislative action, and are there going to be other resources to be determined? So we'll wait and see on that. So that is my rather quick update for you. And I think now you head into a panel discussion that'll be led by Sara Quinney. Sara takes the lead in coordinating these meetings. And a lot of times I think we take for granted that we're familiar with her and she never really gets the introduction she deserves. So I want to make sure we recognize Sara. Sara is a professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Division of Clinical Pharmacology within the Department of Medicine at Indiana University School of Medicine. She serves as the director of the Indiana CTSI and Therapeutic Response Modeling Program. She's the assistant scientific director of the Clinical Pharmacology Analytical Core Laboratory and the co-director of the Indiana PrgMed. She received her PharmD and PhD at Purdue and completed clinical pharmacology and biometrics bioinformatics fellowships at Indiana University. So I'm probably going to stop there. I could go on, but please let me introduce Sara. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I actually have just a few slides before I present. We start this panel discussion as well, kind of setting the stage for how MPRINT has been involved and where we touch pieces of the PRGLAC recommendations. So can I get the slides? Okay, thank you. So as you are all aware by now, MPRINT serves as a national resource for expertise in maternal and pediatric therapeutics to conduct and foster therapeutics-focused research in obstetrics, lactation, and pediatrics, while enhancing inclusion of people with disabilities. As part of this, this is how we view the MPRINT Hub as being a resource in the middle of a lot of other resources and events that and groups that touch on maternal and pediatric therapeutics. So as you will hear later tomorrow from our other centers, the MPRINT Hub consists of the IU Ohio State University Data Model Knowledge Research Coordinating Center, which contains our logistics core responsible for setting up this meeting, our outreach and education core, which really supports training, outreach, our webinars, our website, and as well as aspects of this meeting. The pharmacometrics and clinical trial design core, which is led by Rob Bees and myself, to support utilization of pharmacometric modeling approaches and clinical trial designs. The knowledge base and portal core we heard a little bit about yesterday, and we'll hear more about tomorrow from Dr. Lang Lee, who's the co-PI with me on the DMKRCC grant, and a real world evidence core that's co-led by Chris Bartlett and Sean Granis that we heard from yesterday as well. The DMKRCC is supported by Vanderbilt University Medical Center and UCSD Centers of Excellence in Therapeutics. At Vanderbilt, it's led by Prince Canacarroll and Digna Velez Edwards, with a focus on phenotyping and supporting the use of real world evidence in pharmacogenomic data from BioView in pregnant and pediatric populations. UCSD, as you'll hear about in the next session, as well as tomorrow, is really focused on studying the maternal milk infant triad and focus on antibiotics and metabolomics and microbiomics in milk. It is led by Audrey Tremoulet and Tina Chambers, with a host of other amazing supporters and co-PIs there. We also are supported by a number of other networks and hope to continue to build our network as well, including the MFMU, the PTN, Impact, and others, as you can see here. So when reading through the PRGLAC recommendations, it's really hits me that MPRINT hits almost all of the recommendations in some way or other, whether it's through what we do or through our advocacy and support. So I've just kind of listed them out here, and we'll go through some of what we do. Obviously, integrating pregnant and lactating individuals into the clinical research agenda is one of our primary goals. We also advocate and support efforts to continue to harmonize the FDA rules with the common rule. Recently, I've been involved in some efforts for that as well. In recommendation 2, it's increasing the quantity, quality, and timeliness of therapeutics research. Again, MPRINT is providing additional resources and funding for research through our opportunity and support pool, as well as helping to maximize usability of existing data through our knowledge base, our real world evidence and phenotyping cores, as well as the pharmacometrics core. Recommendation 3 is to expand the workforce of clinicians and research investigators. And recommendation 5, to develop and implement evidence-based communication strategies. Both the IU, OSU, DMKRCC, and Vanderbilt's Vice MPRINT have specific cores dedicated to education and training. The DMKRCC has the outreach and education core, but we also have AIMS in our pharmacometrics core to provide training and education as well to the community. Vanderbilt has specific core focused on the Precision Therapeutics Academy, and UCSD also is quite involved in training and education throughout their cores as well. From an outreach and development of communication standpoint, we've looked at utilizing social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter largely now to promote research and education in maternal and pediatric therapeutics. One of the well-received aspects of this is our social media campaign using visual abstracts, as you can see an example here, and hopefully you will see several examples downstairs during our poster session today. And then we also provide, as I mentioned, the grant funding to support advancements in therapeutic research and training. Recommendation 4 is to remove regulatory barriers to research. And while this is largely, something we can't do directly through MPRINT, we are advocating for updates and guidelines. For instance, I presented a couple of weeks ago at the FDA Maryland CERC workshop on clinical pharmacology guidances and updating those and through other aspects of regulatory advocacy. Recommendation 6 is to create a public awareness campaign to engage the public and healthcare providers. Tina Chambers has her mother to baby program, which is really focused on this and providing information on pregnancy and lactation registries and other information on medication use in pregnancy to the public. And we also have our social media campaigns where we're beginning to focus more on that as well. We've also, in support of this, some of the sub-aims of this, the data sharing committee and our copper supplement looking at sharing of biobank and biospecimen samples is also a fit under this aim as well. In recommendation 7, to reduce liability to facilitate an evidence base for new therapeutics products, we are helping to identify studies needed to obtain clinically relevant information to inform and support dosing and safety, both through our knowledge base and pharmacometrics and clinical trial design core, as well as through the CET support. Recommendation 8 is to develop programs to study off-patent products using BPCA as an example. The MPRINT hub is quite active in supporting the PRGLAC prioritization process, utilizing data from our knowledge base as well as our real-world evidence cores on medication use in support of the RFI that was recently completed for that. And we will be attending and supporting the meeting in July, looking at PRGLAC prioritization. Recommendation 13 to optimize registries. I think we heard yesterday a little bit about that, of how we're working with the real-world evidence core to support and the knowledge portal to help support common data elements. And again, Tina Chambers mother to baby program is really one of the great resources for several academic focused registries for medications. I think this slide is really self-explanatory in where we can fit within these recommendations. Recommendation 9 to implement a proactive approach to protocol development and study design. Again, we're participating in the prioritization process. We have the pharmacometrics clinical trial design core, which supports protocol design and development. Number 10 is to develop programs to drive therapeutic discovery and development. And we work with this through our advocacy support, supporting FDA guidelines, guidance development, as well as making data available to other investigators, and our opportunity and support pool fundings, which are aimed to advancing therapeutics research. Recommendation 11 is utilize and improve existing resources for data. We've helped review and address the ability of pregnancy regulations to maximize, pregnancy registries to maximize enrollment and make data available for resources through our copper collaboration, as well as you heard in several of the talks yesterday. And then our TRRP, led by Majed Constantine, utilizing exosomes for assessing risk assessment is an important aspect of this as well, and improving the use of biomarkers to support efficacy and safety data. Finally, recommendation 12 is to leverage established and support new infrastructures and collaboration. I think the MPRINT is one of the few things that is a new result from PRGLAC recommendations, with some of the funding directly supporting us. We also have leveraged new events such as the mother-baby linkage discussed yesterday by our real-world evidence core. We've looked at efforts to track pregnancy outcomes data through the knowledge base and real-world evidence core, and are also looking at innovative methods for data analytics for these data as well. So I think, as you can see, our research really fits along these lines of the PRGLAC recommendations. So with that, I would like to invite our panelists to come for a panel discussion and audience questions. First is Dr. Christina Chambers, who's a distinguished professor of pediatrics and chief of the Division of Environmental Science and Health at UC San Diego. As I mentioned, she's a multi-PI on the MPRINT CET. Dr. Sharon Nachman is the chief of the Division of Infectious Disease at Renaissance School of Medicine and at Stony Brook University, and the Impact PI. And she and Tina both served along with me on the PRGLAC implementation task force. And Dr. Erin Cleary is an assistant professor of OBGYN in the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine at Indiana University School of Medicine. She has an interest in research in pregnancy and lactation, and as a mother herself has become an advocate for lactation. And then Dr. Tamorah Lewis is a physician scientist and chief of neonatology at in clinical pharmacology and toxicology at SickKids in Toronto, and has completed her clinical pharmacology fellowship as well. So, and then Sue, would you like to join us as well? So, all right. So I thought I would just start our panel discussion by having you briefly introduce, not necessarily yourselves, but how you work with PRGLAC and how it influences your positions. So.
There, is that it? Great. All right. Thank you, Sarah. And I have to say, first of all, that in the 30 years that I've been doing this, it's so amazing to see PRGLAC actually exist and continue to exist. It's such a tremendous initiative that has really raised awareness and brought to the fore. I think that there's this huge need and huge critical gap in knowledge and training and ability to fill these gaps that hasn't been done heretofore, and bringing this to the forefront, and not only bringing it to the forefront, but also sticking with it. So the PRGLAC task force, over multiple years has identified what the issues are, but then to follow up and do the due diligence in terms of making the recommendations and evaluating them. And I'm encouraged to see that although the evaluation process is just starting, and I am completely convinced that we can't expect a huge amount of progress in the short amount of time that we have had since these recommendations have been made, that it's not just a dusty report on the shelf, that it's something that will move forward and hopefully have action and some teeth behind it. As Sarah mentioned, in addition to my involvement with MPRINT, which has largely been through the human milk research biorepository at UC San Diego, which is a nationwide biorepository of human milk and metadata collected from women who are willing to participate in this real world data resource. My other involvement has been with Mother to Baby, which hopefully most of you know is a network of counseling services across the U.S. that's been around since the 80s that provides information direct to consumer, pregnant and lactating individuals, and to healthcare providers from one of our 14 services about exposures in pregnancy and lactation. So provides individualized information that can help guide people and does fulfill to some extent the communication recommendations of the PRGLAC recommendations by virtue of, this direct one-on-one communication, but we also produce fact sheets on several hundred exposures that are housed in the National Library of Medicine and are widely disseminated. And we also host the app for LactMed, which is a resource also NICHD and National Library of Medicine support for information on exposures in lactation. So that's one piece that's moving forward. But I think the communication piece is incredibly important, and lots of misinformation out there. But I think the biggest gap is the lack of data to communicate about. So it's super frustrating to talk to a pregnant or lactating person and say, we just don't have any data in humans on this exposure, or we have very limited data. So I think the recommendations that I'm the most excited about are the ones that focus on evaluating existing and or established infrastructure and collaborations and expanding on those. And I think MPRINT is really uniquely positioned to try to do that from some of the initiatives we heard about yesterday, but better linking those across other types of initiatives. And Mother to Baby is a perfect example because we collect data on pregnancy and lactation outcomes, but that real world data is not yet connected to other data sources in an integrated way that could be more informative. And I think also the mention about ownership is critical, that in the end, where the buck stops is where the action is going to take place. And I don't know whether MPRINT is the place to own something. We probably don't have the power to do that, but I do think whoever owns it needs to own some of these recommendations, and MPRINT can be the implementation arm of those recommendations. And so I'm excited about that. And then, of course, and I'll always have to end on this, it's not a zero-sum game. So resources have to be put towards this if these recommendations are going to be realized. And I think there are avenues where that can be done. And the BPCA example for off-patent drugs and the Cuddle study is a perfect example for lactation, that's something along those lines for the vast majority of medications used in pregnancy for which there is inadequate or no human data, that would be an avenue that might be fruitful. Thanks.
Okay, you've said it all. I'm done. No. So I'm the PI of the Impact Network, and thank you, Sarah, for the shout outs. It's nice to see everyone here. Impact is a maternal child international clinical trial group. Originally, we're supposed to have focused just on HIV, and as someone who's from New York and always pushing the envelope, we don't actually just focus on HIV. We do TB, we're doing hepatitis C, we're doing syphilis. We're pushing the envelope all the time on maternal child clinical trials. And we got involved with PRGLAC sort of on the back end of things because we were doing clinical trials in women at international settings who either had TB, at risk for TB, HIV, and I want to say rolling those trials out and looking back and saying, so where are the recommendations? Where are the guidelines? Where are the sort of the rules that we have to follow? Who do we have to talk with? So that's how we got involved as a global unit with PRGLAC. And like Sarah said, she and I are on the review panel and sort of been spending a lot of time looking and going to the meetings, either Zooming or in person, and saying, how are those recommendations being crafted? Who is going to read them? Who's the end result that's going to have to implement them? And are they translatable to all of our settings across the US, not so much in international settings? So sort of that's the big picture. I'm a clinical trials person. I'm a pediatric HIV infectious disease investigator, but I want to say over time, thank you, Rob. I have learned a lot about pharmacokinetics and all of your pharmacology colleagues. So I actually understand what you talk about now. I don't think I could do the modeling. So one of the things that I'm bringing to PRGLAC is actually thinking big picture about how those clinical trials going to roll out. Where are the dashboards for the data? How can the data be used, domestic or international? And while I appreciate that PRGLAC focus is really on the domestic agenda so much, on my piece on the international side, we bring in more depth to who the patient is. Are the populations different? And are these rules in that data going to apply to all of our populations? You know, when I hear people say, oh, you know, pregnant women, we have to protect them, we have to do this. And I'm like, no, that's the wrong attitude. You need to stop saying that. So, of course, running lots of maternal clinical trials, you know, I have sort of the opposite view. These are populations that want to get involved in. You know, Sara and I were talking last night about PRGLAC, and I sort of went back to my room and thought about stuff and read some more. And I was like, you know, what PRGLAC is missing is community. And we don't, when I went back through the guidelines, I didn't see at any place where was the community involvement mandated, recommended, what were the, you know, points of interest. And, you know, as I sat there and thought about it more and more, I was like, we are writing guidelines, but the population of interest is not receiving those guidelines. So one of the things that, you know, sorry to bring it up here, but one of the things that we need to go back to the review panel and say is there's no points of interest or no discussion about where the community fits in this. Have they even read it? Are they excited about this? Do they want to be involved? You know, we talk about collection of data, but we don't have the participant's voice in that collection of data. And so one of the rules on the impact network is that community has to be involved in 100% of what we do. Our leadership group involves community. Every scientific committee involves community. And we have a community representative on 100% of all concept sheets, clinical trial data analysis. Nothing can be passed or approved without community being at the table, agreeing, writing it, having their name on it, and saying, yes, this is what the rest of our community wants. So I think that the PRGLAC stuff is, I want to say, moving. Obviously, again, the New Yorker, I wanted to move faster, although I appreciate that doesn't always happen. But I think we have to take a step back now on PRGLAC and say, where's the community voice in this? And if it's not there, we need to make sure it's put in there, because that's actually who is the most important. It's not what we think, it's what does the community think. So I'll stop there. That one, you got it.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Sara and the panel for inviting me to participate. My name is Tamorah Lewis, and I'm a neonatologist and a pediatric clinical pharmacologist at SickKids in Toronto. And I think my role on the panel is really to represent sort of the frontline clinician who's helping postpartum women make the decision about the safety of providing breast milk to their infants in the current setting of relative data lack. So I, as a neonatologist, I interact with new moms every day who are not only have the typical amount of worry about providing breast milk to their new infant, but are in the situation where their baby is born either extremely preterm or with serious medical conditions that require them to be in the neonatal ICU for weeks to months. And this is an especially vulnerable population of breastfeeding infants who may have different risk factors and different developmental sequelae of receiving drugs through maternal milk. And so, you know, I think I represent sort of the most vulnerable population of breastfeeding infants who we have to think even more deeply about differences in their ability to metabolize and clear drugs received through maternal milk, and also potential increased organ sensitivity to drugs received through maternal milk. As a pediatric clinical pharmacologist, I think deeply about developmental changes in drug metabolism and response in the first weeks to months of life, and also genetic variability in drug metabolism and clearance, and how this interacts with developmental changes in the first months of life. And, you know, as a physician scientist, I think the PRGLAC initiative is incredibly important, especially because, you know, I think historically we haven't brought all of our power to bear to bring all these diverse expertise together and do the type of team science that we need to really provide clear answers to what I'll call the end users of the information. And by end users, I mean individual mothers making decisions about whether or not to continue their medicines or to provide breast milk to their baby, but also end users being community pediatricians, community neonatologists, the frontline providers who are counseling women and helping them make these important decisions. So, when I was thinking about my perspective and what I think could be a really impactful effort on behalf of MPRINT or PRGLAC, I was thinking about pushing the bar even further about knowledge synthesis and knowledge translation. So, all of our pregnancy and lactation pharmacology research are published in pharmacology journals. And no community pediatrician or community neonatologist is going to ever read our pharmacology research. And so how do we bridge that knowledge translation gap? And so my wish would be that a preeminent pediatric journal take ownership of this and actually create end user friendly publications that compile all the relevant knowledge around, let's say, a medication by class. So let's say antidepressants, and actually put together in a user-friendly format what is known, what is not known, what are the risks, or what is safe. And it would almost be analogous to the CPIC guidelines for pharmacogenetics. The CPIC guidelines are meant to make pharmacogenetics accessible to any prescriber. And we need to do something similar, I think, for pregnancy and lactation pharmacology research.
Thank you again, Sara, for the invitation. Again, I'm Erin Cleary. I'm a maternal fetal medicine faculty at Indiana University and just really, really honored to be here on this panel with some amazing folks. And again, it's hard to say what else is left to be said when everyone kind of hit the nail on the head. I think I'll just echo, Dr. Lewis's sentiments on being that frontline clinician. As a MFM provider, I take care of a lot of high-risk dyads, mostly in the antepartum, period. But I've become kind of a go-to person for folks with breastfeeding concerns, especially our NICU moms. In Indianapolis, we have a tertiary center, quaternary center for our NICU. So a lot of those folks aren't even local or have an OB provider or some other provider that can troubleshoot when things are not going well. I think just backing up a little bit, though, I really appreciated the timeline that Dr. Rahman presented. I don't know when along that timeline, I became aware of PRGLAC. I remember being excited about the fact that this existed and that there'd be more inclusion in pregnant and lactating folks, in research endeavors. But again, highlighting what other folks have said, just really getting this, what we know and what we don't know out to both patients and their providers in the community has been, really lacking. And I think just having a sense of not only is it exposures, whether it is, uterine or via breast milk, but really just helping people reach their goals. It's so much more than is, breastfeeding safe. Is anything that's exposed in my milk going to be harmful to my baby? I care for people every week who present and discontinue their medications upon finding out that they were pregnant, often because they got really bad advice from a well-intentioned, but somebody who just didn't know and didn't know where to turn to get better information about the risks and benefits of continuing the medication in pregnancy. Just like the placenta and the breast are not the same, exposure via trimester matters a lot too. So I have a lot of conversations with patients about what it means for medication exposure in the first, second, or third trimester. And then having some education on why something may have been safer in pregnancy, but not in lactation, or vice versa. I also think a lot about just the kind of mechanics of lactation and why folks don't meet their breastfeeding goals, even above and beyond whether medication, or other exposure is safe. Just supporting people in those early days and weeks on, getting a good latch and making sure that the infant is transferring and gaining weight. People with the best of intentions and goals often fall short. And, just knowing that a lactating breast is really treated different than any other organ in the body. If somebody's heart or kidney is failing, we do everything that we can to fix it. When someone has a lactation problem and they're not making enough milk or they're having difficulty, a lot of people just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we have this thing called formula. It's okay. Your baby will be fine. And I think that just does such a disservice to our dyads for the short and long-term health for both. I think that's all the things I wanted to say. So thank you.
And you guys have already been introduced to me, so I do co-chair the implementation working group for PRGLAC. I'm involved, and my contribution, I think, to this panel is at kind of a slightly 30,000-foot view level. So being a little longer in my career, I get the luxury of serving on advisory committees and steering committees for maternal and pediatric clinical trial networks, for training programs that are putting out pharmacology trainees in the pediatric and maternal space. I get my chance to be involved sort of on the policy side, working as a technical advisor for supranational organizations like WHO as it relates to dosing implementation for pregnancy and pediatrics. And then part of my side job, my side hustle, our group is working with state level HIEs to really understand how to optimize their data to answer questions as it relates to maternal health.
Thank you. So I guess, I've got the list of recommendations on the board that I know is hard for you all to see. But overall, do you think the PRGLAC has advanced research in maternal health? And which areas do you see having the most impact, of which recommendations have the most impact versus the least impact?
I guess, from my side on the clinical trial piece, I want to say, I don't think we've made enough impact on it. I think that, we recently had a study that we were all good on. We were going to do long-acting injectables on antiretrovirals during pregnancy, postpartum, et cetera. 100%, everything good. We went to the FDA and they were like, oh no, you can't do this. It's not safe. We don't have enough data. And it was like, well, you just kind of threw the whole thing up. And I think that collaboration or PRGLAC rules or discussion with FDA, I want to say, has not moved far enough. And, it doesn't matter what the drug is, what the intervention is. Every time we have a study that crosses that idea, pregnant women are going to be getting this novel drug, despite it's being licensed in adults, et cetera. The answer is, oh, no, you can't. So I think that for me, the PRGLAC recommendation on, forgot what number it is, and it's number 9. I really think that we need to perhaps push harder on what has to get done in order to get these drugs, protecting them from research versus protecting them through research. We haven't moved the needle far enough on that one. And, I appreciate the PRGLAC stuff, and I think it's great. I wanted to say I want to gallop it faster on that one, because we are losing time every day of the week. And that makes no sense. And, the joke is when we were writing the protocol, we're like, oh, it has to get done. People want to use it. And as we're writing it, somebody put a single case report saying, hey guys, we did this. We're already giving this drug. And you sit there going, oh no. So that difference between a drug being licensed in adults, and we need to study it in pregnant and postpartum populations, and making our colleagues at the FDA understand it's happening. Stop saying no. And I think PRGLAC can be a force to do that by saying it must be a yes correctly and in a timely fashion.
I'm going to take a bit more of an optimistic view. I think part of me has watched the pediatric initiative for the last 30 years, so I know it takes a bit more time. I do believe that PRGLAC has really moved the conversation forward. And I would say one of the biggest gains so far has been the removal of pregnant women as a vulnerable population. That's a huge win.
I'm the pushy New Yorker. And I appreciate that. I think you're right. The fact that it's not listed as a vulnerable population is fantastic, except in most people's minds that are sitting there on our review panels, even though it says it's not, they're going, they are. You're never going to get them to consent. I'm like, I consent patients every day of the week. Of course I am. You know, we consented patients to give them remdesivir when they had COVID in the ICUs and they were pregnant. Nobody said no. So when I think about it, you're right. We've gotten the language changed, but we have not changed their attitudes.
I wonder, Dr. Chambers, your success with consenting to is just all in the approach of what are the alternatives, right? So what are the risks and the benefits? What are the consequences and the alternatives? And maybe pushing that through at the FDA level too, of, you know, all the benefits of, you know, other things that infants get via breast milk and the benefits of ongoing lactation for that individual compared with not getting them. And then what is our risk threshold? And, you know, is it at the level that's appropriate?
Yeah, I'll just say absolutely. That's part of the counseling discussion always. And now it's, as you saw in the revised label, it's part of the product label now, talking about what is the contribution of the condition itself that the mother has and poor treatment of the condition such as asthma. And that has to be part of every conversation. What is lack of action going to do? One other thing I wanted to say, and I know there are people waiting to comment, is I really think PRGLAC serves as a framework for evaluating, keeping our eye on the prize. And if nothing else, that is so important because it provides an ongoing way to say, we did this, we made little progress there, we made a little progress there, but looking at the big picture rather than this sort of piecemeal, you know, head in the sand approach that we've had through my entire career, that there's now a framework to focus on what we have done and where we still have some place to go.
I just want to briefly add about recommendation number 3. I think that call to increase the number of people who are adequately trained and doing this type of research is really important. But, you know, I think we have to get a little more deep into the weeds about how we're going to actually implement that. You know, I think we have to come up with ways to de-risk this decision to build your academic career on obstetric and lactation pharmacology because there hasn't been a lot of people doing it in the past and because there's, you know, really challenging, you know, grant funding situations and support for physician scientists at academic institutions. I think we're going to have to get a little bit more pragmatic about ways we're going to support young investigators who want to really go into this field and stay in this field.
Yeah, we have an entire session tomorrow on training and education. So that may be an important aspect to consider there. So, Erin?
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear the comments about community engagement and outreach. So I have a thought on that now and a specific question. So I sort of think about that in terms of output and input. And one thing that we're currently undertaking, Camille's leading this with Diane, a colleague in the PPB branch, is a prioritization process for existing medications for pregnant and lactating individuals. So one thing that Perdita actually pulled up from the National Library of Medicine was the list of search terms that people have put in the last year. And that was really interesting to see. And Lang's helping us process that. Because I think that gets to what is the community actually asking? You know, what are they sitting there in the search engines and going, well, I actually want to know about this, because I think that will help with prioritization of what we should study to generate that evidence and for that communication. So my question is, you know, that's just the web search for LactMed at NLM. And I think this is probably to Tina first. Where can we get the data, you know, the information for what people are looking for drugs in, you know, through your app and how do we do that for pregnancy? Because it would be really good to know not just what, you know, experts in the field are telling us they think the drugs are that should be studied. What are the ones that women are trying to get information on?
Yeah, we've done that previously some years ago with some FDA funding, looked at what are the questions that people call us about, what drugs in pregnancy and lactation. We're in the process of doing an update of that with the HRSA funding that we have in CDC. So we'll be able to actually look at prioritizing what the most common questions are. It's no surprise. antidepressants high on the list, and recognizing though this is a select group of people who contact us, or who search the BlackMed app. So it's that being said, it's not population based, but at least it's people who have taken the initiative to try to look into this, and that's
Yeah, no, it'd be great to be able to get that data, even if it's not public, to help inform the process. But also, like you just pointed out, other ways, because that is, there's a, I don't want to say bias necessarily, but we're only looking at one slice of the inquiries there. So what are other ways that we could think about getting to that?
I wonder about so many networks do have web presence, and they all tick and count the questions that come in. So certainly we do, our congenital CMV group does, the maternal fetal medicine group does. I wonder if we could also survey those funded networks to see what are the questions community is asking them, because we all count the ticks, we all count the questions. It's not a big issue to find out, but amongst those pillars that are not necessarily connected, what are the questions community is asking them would really help. God knows I don't want to go on Twitter or any social media, but I wonder, if there was some way of using some AI type tool or chatbot, what we could pick up of those community questions also. And, I wonder, what are the large community-based organizations out there? What are they talking about? And is that language getting into us providers, clinical researchers, et cetera? I think that there is data out there. We just have to be very, very creative about finding it. And, our Hispanic populations are not calling FDA, et cetera, because they don't speak Spanish. So, that you've already X'd out a whole population. So asking those community-based organizations, what are those families thinking about also? And of course, everything takes money, and, no, I don't have a money tree in the backyard.
I might add that, CDC has been doing some work lately to really engage individuals in the communities to understand not only how they feel about research, but where they get their information from. And I think that will be very helpful to us to understand the sources that they are using to identify the information or the questions that they have.
Yeah, Lang from Ohio State University. I was looking at item 13, optimize the registry databases. And I think the question is, are those registries open to all general investigator for research purpose? Or if not, what will be the best way to make it more, available or integrated in a way that people can really get in and do some secondary data analysis for research?
So I'll answer that one for my purposes, because I read a bunch of pregnancy registries. I'm going to make this lady happy here. They are one-off pregnancy registries that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies for the purpose of meeting post-marketing commitments or requirements to the FDA. So there are some guardrails around what can and cannot be shared. However, we consent people to participate in all of our pregnancy registries, as well as, this is nationwide, as well as any, additional things that we recruit people for that are not industry sponsored. We have NIH funded studies as well, to future uses of those data, so that they can then be de-identified and used for secondary data analysis. And that is possible to access with, appropriate application. Personally, I think the way that we do it is the clunkiest, most stupid way of conducting pregnancy registries, and we should have one single pregnancy registry. Stop this ridiculous, very expensive, very cumbersome process that fails half the time to produce a target sample size, and just open it up to the community of pregnant and lactating persons to say anybody who's taking a new drug in particular, but anybody who's taking a drug can be part of this. And we collect the data in a standard fashion, harmonized data elements and so on, and that we make that available and a part of the culture of participating in something that's so important to all of us. So that's
I just have a couple questions from online. one of which I think we might have touched on this a little bit already, but how is everyone thinking about providing information that isn't lost on the noise and disinformation on the internet? Outside of this meeting, the typical new mom isn't going to MPRINT. They are going to get their information by a Google search. Disinformation is a serious concern, and there needs to be credible sources of information that healthcare providers all point to. And then a second question is curious to hear the reasons that the FDA said your trial could not proceed.
Why the FDA said the trial can't proceed? The last one I can answer in one second. They didn't like it. They thought it was too much risk, and they wanted us to proceed so super slowly that it almost invalidates getting the trial done in a timely fashion.
Regarding where end users, look first to receive information about medication use and its safety in pregnancy and lactation, I think PRGLAC does sort of get to this important need for us to create sort of a wave of valid information that is showing up first on Google searches or easily accessible on social media. And, of course, things like the fact sheets and LACMed are very helpful, but they're still written in a language that a lay person cannot very readily digest. And so, one idea would be to create sort of a knowledge portal that's written for lay users that can really compile relevant information and then give people access to more deeper or detailed resources if they want it. So in Canada, the University of Toronto School of Public Health has created a new program called First Exposures, which is really geared towards providing a one-stop shop for the lay community to find information about lactation and pregnancy pharmacology. And it's sort of like NIH LACMed, but for lay people instead of written for prescribers. And so I think, PRGLAC has the opportunity to really encourage creation of resources like that. And, you could try to ensure that they come up early in internet searches, but also I think those institutions could be posting regularly on places like social media. So do you have a question about antidepressant use in pregnancy? This is the source that you should be checking. That sort of thing.
And PRGLAC is encouraging the development of different communication strategies, but it was a very astute question that was asked. And the observation has been mentioned here is that there are unique people that are really going to these resources. The majority of individuals are going to family, friends, the internet. And so that is a much bigger challenge that extends beyond just pregnancy and lactation.
I wonder if there would be an opportunity to kind of take advantage of some folks that already have a pretty online, large online presence. I have a few favorite, lactation consultants with a great Instagram page, and I direct my patients there because I've vetted most of the information. I think it is, safe and reputable and really good, just kind of practical advice, and often is in easily consumable, short little videos. And so, identifying some folks that are already out there that patients are, people are using, and to almost give kind of like the PRGLAC stamp of approval would potentially be a way to accelerate instead of having to come up with a lot of, new content de novo.
So it sounds silly, but what we've done in the network is we've actually asked the community to help us how to present the study to their friends, neighbors, colleagues. And the visual aids that they've come up with are, I want to say, wildly different than the stuff that we as clinicians and investigators would have come up with, but we've moved to, so we actually now use flip charts that our community reps have made for the new clinical trials to explain the study to everyone that we'd like to enroll on it. And that voice of the community actually is quite different than ours. And it really gets their points across, I want to say, quite nicely, and also obviously vetted. But I really, wonder how we can pull community into a lot more of, the guidelines or whatever that we're saying that here's the right person. Here's someone looks like you talking about your question. They don't look like me in a white coat.
Hi, I'm Kimberly from University at Buffalo. So my comment slash question revolves around the communication again. So I'm thinking about what to do when you're expecting and where those women go, because in a lot of cases, those women don't have their first OB appointment until late in their first trimester. And I think about how many apps people are downloading that are comparing the size of your baby to a fruit that week. And if you could target those apps as resources that they're already going to reach out to these individuals, and if that's been considered.
I'll say absolutely, and this relates to the previous question as well. That you have this vast array of questionable resources that are available on the internet, and the task is to kind of drown those out, so that you have resources that are vetted and are trusted and accurate in terms of providing that information. And then you have to have the capacity to do it. So when you think about it, we're talking about potentially 4 million people a year who need to ask that question. They should be asking questions about the exposures that they've had in pregnancy and the ones they anticipate having and ones that they would have in lactation. But to Dr. Lewis's point, I think she's absolutely right, that we need to have vetted resources that are promoted as these are trusted resources that are accessible through multiple channels. So I think one of the things that we're seeing, just talking about the influencers, not to be named, but there's an economist in the US who has become a huge influence on pregnancy and lactation decisions with no credibility in that area at all, but partly because she's out there bringing up the topics that people are interested in and making, pronouncements about these are what the data say. So I think being first and foremost out there in multiple modes, including social media, with the caveat that you can't explain complex things all the time in one sentence, safe or not safe. It's more nuanced than that. And it's very nuanced if the exposure has already taken place as opposed to one that you're thinking about in the future. And so you really have to be careful about that. But I think PRGLAC recommendations regarding communications are very much in line with saying we need to do way more about making sure there are channels that people have that they can go to that they trust.
Hazel?
Do I have time for a question?
Yeah, I think we have time for one or two more. So depends how quick they are.
This is super quick. I'm glad that you mentioned influencers so that I didn't have to be the one that brought that up. My name's Aislinn. I'm with Indiana University. And 2 years ago, I did a research paper on misinformation on antibiotics in TikTok. And the first thing I asked was my pharmacy class. I asked how many of them use TikTok, and all of them raised their hands. And I asked them what they used it for. And they were mostly telling me like parenting skills or pregnancy information. And that was 2 years ago. Like that, you guys are saying Google and the internet, like these guys are on TikTok watching 30-second, 10-second videos of like 19-year-olds telling them what they should take when they're pregnant. So I think that it would be really, really good. Like, I think that our primary space, unfortunately, is going to be like TikTok, like little short informative videos. And I think that to your point, like safe and not safe is maybe not the correct answer, but maybe we could even have like a little, like, if you ever played like a video game, like you have a life bar chart when you're playing that's like, you have this much health left and then you're like not good here. We could have like a little like bar chart maybe that's like this percentage experience this side effect, 60% experience this side effect. Here's like the data on, like, I don't know, or like a QR code or something, but just like really quick, accessible information. I don't know what you guys think about that. Thanks.
Can I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to reinforce or encourage. I work on the AIDS malignancy consortium as well. And through those studies, they've done an amazing job with community advisory boards. They were built into the study. They were funded within the study. went on for 10 years and were very powerful in bringing that voice of the people and creating videos, et cetera. And I think when we're designing studies, starting there is going to be very helpful for us.
Jed.
Magic Constantine from Ohio State. Sarah, thank you for organizing this, and thanks for the panelists for their time and presentations. Sharon, your comments were music to many people's ears. So, and then it's, I think it's, you know, going back, like, for example, number 4 or number 2, and we've been hearing about PRGLAC and talking about PRGLAC for a long time, but what are some of the actionable steps that happen to reduce barriers? We removed vulnerable population, fine, but it's still in the mind of IRB and FDA and every other regulatory bodies, even for providers who may not allow their patients to participate in studies. And there are several examples how this is happening, how it's impacting research and developing of therapeutics. I'm going to give you 2, and I have many others. You mentioned COVID. During COVID, the NIH trials for COVID therapeutics excluded pregnant women. The UK trials did not. So the data that we received on the use of steroids to reduce this severity of disease were from the UK. And we didn't have any data from here. And then physicians were left to treat patients and give vaccines with no knowledge. That's one example that could have been, that was after the PRGLAC, and there could have been, this is a golden opportunity to have studied these medications in pregnancy. As a matter of fact, remdesivir has been studied during Ebola before and has been proven to be safe. And we're not allowed to be part in these trials this time. And the other one, the MFMU conducted a large trial of tranexamic acid in pregnancy in women undergoing C-section to reduce postpartum hemorrhage and transfusion. And the drug was required to be given after cord clamp because of concern of neonatal exposure, when in fact, we knew that the concentration of the drug in the cord blood was so low compared to what these neonates are exposed if they undergo surgery after birth. And despite of all of this, the drug was given after cord clamp, and now there's more data. And in fact, there was a proposal yesterday to the MFMU to repeat the trial and spend another $12 million, but give the drug before skin incision. So these are 2 recent examples in which, yeah, we have these PRGLAC recommendations and we should do it, but they're not implemented. So I think until we get to a point where we push back against some of the reviews, and there are many other reviews like this, we say it's not safe, we don't have enough, we're never gonna have enough data. Data is, and safety is cumulative. The more information we have, the more, but unless we do these trials, we're never gonna have good enough data, and people are using it without these data anyway. So thank you.
You know, and amongst the vulnerable populations, and I say that in quotations, you have pregnant women. And then on my side, we have HIV infected pregnant women. So Pfizer got their RSV vaccine licensed in pregnancy and excluded HIV infected pregnant women. So now we have to go and do a second study to use a vaccine that we know saves lives in our vulnerable vulnerables, which for me is, you know, obviously disturbing. But I really think that it's one thing to have changed the language. It's another thing to have changed the attitudes. And the only way you're going to change attitude is if community pushes. We saw it with ACT UP. ACT UP was the HIV community that pushed at the FDA, and I want to say they did a sit-in and close the FDA down. And then the FDA went, oh, I guess we should get those drugs licensed for HIV infected patients in a little bit more of a timely fashion. So not for nothing, I think PRGLAC really has helped. But again, the New Yorker in me says, how far can we push the envelope? Where can we push it? And without community involvement in every one of these, just even reading them and understanding them and saying, that's not good enough. Where is good enough? I think it's going to take a longer time.
Yeah, not a question. Quick. First, the second most important thing I think is you need to look a slogan. And I would ask you to go back to the slogan that the Academy of Pediatrics developed during the pediatric phase of this, which was 40 years ago, when we were in the same situation as you are now. And that is protecting children with research instead of from research. You can use that again. But the other thing is, I don't think you're going to get anywhere until you get, I mean, you need resources. Resources are not going to come from the pharmaceutical industry, I don't think, but they might. But I think you need legislative support. And we had Senator Dodd, for particular reasons, he suddenly realized children needed help. And there are now actually women senators. There weren't any then, or very few. And I'm asking which senator is this problem recognized by? I can't think of any. Now, there's no one out there. You need to get a you need two. Unfortunately, in the current situation, you may need three, but you need one on both sides of the aisle who say, this is my issue. I'm going to get funding. I'm going to get this changed. The FDA is not going to change without that. You're not going to get funding without that. And I ask you, you're involved. Name me a senator, second best, some House of Representatives people who have this issue on their table foremost. Until you have that, you're not going to get anywhere.
All right, I think that's a great point to end on. And one of the actual things we found in the implementation working group was that many of these are not going anywhere without additional legislative support. And, we can write what we'd love to do, but without the funding, it's not going to happen. So thank you for that comment. And thank you all for a great discussion. Thanks to our panelists for their input as well.